Good day. Today is Monday, 2nd December, and as I make this program, there continue to be signs of some stabilization of the military situation in Syria and more evidence that Syria's allies, its various allies around the world, are coming to its rescue. Specifically, there are now reports of large movements of Shia militia from Iraq into Syria itself. Apparently there's film and pictures of long convoys of Shia militia troops. I should say that these people, though they are referred to as militia, they are in fact a highly organized military force, very heavily equipped with tanks and armored vehicles and artillery and that sort of thing. So they are a potent force if deployed into battle. Anyway, the reports say that they're moving in large columns into Syria, though it will of course take time before they reach the front lines in Idlib and Aleppo and Hama provinces in northwest Syria. Probably a couple of days, maybe a week, and of course it will probably take some time beyond that before they're ready to join the battle. Anyway, they are moving. The Syrian military is moving. The Syrian military does appear to have consolidated its positions around the key city of Hama, and their front lines around Hama for the moment continue to hold. There are reports that Kurdish militia, which are aligned in some respects to the Syrian government, though they're not always reliable allies of the Syrian government, to put it mildly, that they're also involved in standoffs with the insurgent fighters, the Islamist jihadi fighters. And by the way, there is some uncertainty as to the actual extent of the territory that these fighters, these Islamist fighters, do control. There has been a huge amount of film coming from Aleppo, and I have no doubt that the city, most of the city, is indeed under their control, and it seems that the airport also is under control. But there are some reports which suggest that the Syrian government still has some kind of a military presence in Aleppo, though it's difficult for me to say quite how extensive that presence is, if of course, it even exists at all. As for the Russians, they have changed their commander in Syria. A previous general who had been sent there, who was one of the generals who had previously commanded in Ukraine, but who perhaps some people think was less effective in Ukraine than he might have been. Anyway, he was the person, the general, who was in overall charge in Syria until the events of the last couple of days. He's now been replaced by a different general who has apparently a rather more aggressive reputation. There continue to be reports that Wagner fighters and drone operators are arriving in Syria from Russia, and in the meantime the Russian Air Force from its base at Khmeimim has been extremely active and appears to have been doing significant damage to the Islamist fighters in northwest Syria. I've seen an analysis of the military situation in northwest Syria done by a Western military expert whose analysis was published in the British media. So neither he nor the British media are at all sympathetic to the government of President Assad. But this person took the view that the Islamist or jihadi positions in the countryside, in Aleppo and in southern Idlib provinces, are very vulnerable to attack from the air and to potential counterattacks by armoured forces, Syrian armoured forces or Shia militia armoured forces if it comes to that. And this person thought that it would not be, appeared to think that it would not be difficult for the Syrian army, if it gets itself reorganised, to roll back this offensive. It might be much more difficult, however, to recapture Aleppo itself if the fighters there are able to dig in and to fortify their positions. So, anyway, lots of indications that military aid is now coming to Syria, and I suspect that I haven't yet seen any reports about this. Provided the ceasefire in Lebanon holds, we'll start to see Hezbollah fighters return to Syria as well in some number. If we add up all of the forces that are concentrating against the Islamist fighters in northeast Syria, then it seems to me that before long they're going to face an offensive which would be overwhelmingly powerful if their number is indeed limited to the 15,000 men suggested by Alistair Crook in the programme that Glenn Deason and I recently did with him. So, obviously, one can't be sure, but certainly the level of military aid to President Assad appears to be very strong. And President Assad and his government continue to get messages of support from various governments around the world, from Iran, obviously, we'll come to the Iranians shortly, from the Russians, obviously. China has now also weighed in and has made statements in support of President Assad's government. But of course, the key change as compared with the Syrian civil war of 2011 to 19 is in the attitude of the key Arab states, the Gulf monarchies, first and foremost. Previously, in the previous war, they had strongly supported the insurgency against President Assad. This time, importantly, they are not doing so. And in fact, the president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, has had a telephone call to discuss the situation in Syria with one of the key monarchs of the Gulf, the Emir of Qatar. And as we will see, the actual Iranian account of this telephone call is extremely friendly. Now, Qatar's role is crucial because alongside Saudi Arabia, it had been Qatar which had provided the strongest financial and military support amongst the Arab states to the rebels who were fighting President Assad's government during the 2011-2019 war. So the fact that the Emir of Qatar is, on the contrary, working this time with the Iranians to try to stabilize the situation in Syria and in effect implicitly supporting the maintenance, the preservation of President Assad's government is a strong sign that the Arab states are not looking to support the insurgency against President Assad in the way that they had supported the previous insurgency that had been launched against him. I'll read the Iranian account of this telephone call between Pezeshkian and the Emir of Qatar It's provided by the Tasnim, the Iranian Tasnim news agency. In a telephone call with Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, on Monday, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said, "We seek a secure region that preserves the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Islamic countries, allowing all nations in the region to live in peace and tranquility." The president made the comments amid the resurgence of terrorist groups in northern Syria. He noted that the spread of insecurity and terrorism benefits no country, stressing that all regional nations should cooperate to confront this evil phenomenon and protect the regional security before any foreign intervention. The Iranian president appreciated Qatar's pivotal role as a mediator in regional crises, especially concerning Gaza. "We hope your determination to create peace in the region will continue, and together we can enhance unity and cohesion among Islamic countries while improving peace and security." And then Pezeshkian spoke about the good relations between Iran and Qatar. He praised Qatar's role in the stance, in taking a strong stance against Israel. And then the Iranians say that the Emir of Qatar emphasized that Tehran and Doha, that's the capital of Qatar, share common stances on regional issues, especially on Gaza and Lebanon, as well as the necessity of preserving Syria's territorial integrity. Stressing the need for the cooperation and consultations between Iran and Qatar to help resolve regional issues, he said, "We believe what is happening in Syria shows that stability and security cannot be achieved there without dialogue and a political solution. In this regard, we are fully prepared to play a role in establishing peace in Syria through a political agreement." Now, we will come to what all that means shortly, but the particular stress that the Iranians and the Qataris are making about preserving Syria's territorial integrity is, I suspect, a signal addressed to Turkish President Erdogan. There have been various times when various people in Turkey, not I think Erdogan himself, have floated the possibility of Turkey establishing some kind of protectorate in northern Syria. Some have even spoken of this extending. Some apparently have even spoken to extending this to Aleppo itself. I want to stress I've never myself seen originals of these alleged statements, but I've heard that they do exist. There's been a long-standing concern, certainly it's been widely discussed in Syria itself, that Turkey has territorial ambitions in Syria and is using the jihadi fighters as some kind of proxy in order to extend Turkish influence and ultimately control in northern Syria. And, well, the Qataris and the Iranians are basically saying that if that is the plan, then they oppose it and that the Turkish government should be aware of that fact. More importantly is that the Qataris, far from saying that they support the insurgency in Syria, are telling the Iranians that, on the contrary, they're prepared to work with the Iranians to find a solution that enhances the stability of the situation in the region. And more widely, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russian and Turkish foreign ministers have spoken with each other. This took place some days ago. The Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Arakchi, has visited Turkey, where he's had meetings with Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan. And beyond that, Arakci, who's clearly extremely busy at the moment, has actually visited Syria itself, where he has had a meeting with President Bashar al-Assad. And there's film and photograph of that meeting, and that unequivocally confirms that Assad is indeed in Damascus and indeed securely in control in Damascus. And as I said, he's meeting the Iranian foreign minister there. My own view is that all of those reports about Assad being in Russia, about him having meetings with Putin, secret meetings with Putin, I think all of this was misinformation, perhaps intended to facilitate a coup in Damascus, if that was the real plan. There were reports for a number of hours that some kind of coup in Damascus was indeed underway. Of course, classic conditions for organizing a coup is the absence of the leader in charge. The leader is abroad, the coup takes place, but as we've seen, the leader in this case, to be precise, Assad, was clearly in Damascus, and I believe that he has been there all along. So anyway, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of toing and froing. As I said, the Iranians and the Syrians have been meeting. Assad and Arakci have met in Damascus. The Iranians are talking to the Qataris. The Russians have been talking to the Iranians and to the Turks. And the Iranians and the Turks have also been meeting. And in the meantime, large numbers of troops have been sent to Syria from various locations to try to stabilize the situation there. My own sense is that over the next couple of weeks and months, some kind of counteroffensive will indeed begin, and there will be a major push to roll the jihadi fighters back to northern Idlib province, and that, I expect, is indeed what is going to happen. But the fact that the Russians and the Iranians are being very careful in their public statements, the Russian media is a different thing, but the Russians and the Iranians are being very careful in their public statements to pretend that Turkey is not involved in this latest episode, gives a strong indication that they intend, once the situation has been brought back fully under control, to get Assad finally to have that meeting with Erdogan that Erdogan has been constantly seeking. And I should say that the one of the big Arabic television stations, Al Arabiya, more than just a television station, it's a media conglomerate. I believe it's based, by the way, in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, Al Arabiya is in effect saying that the reason this whole operation was launched is because Erdogan had become frustrated by Assad's unwillingness to meet with him, and that he wanted to launch this assault basically in order to force Assad finally to engage with him and to come to this meeting. And I've read similar things in other places as well. I believe even the Iranian media have been hinting at this, that there's been frustration even in Iran at the fact that Assad has consistently refused all overtures from Erdogan for a meeting between the two men. I ought to say, and I think I did not mention this in my program yesterday, that Assad's publicly stated reason for his refusal to meet with Erdogan is the presence of Turkish troops on Syrian territory. He has said that he will not meet with Erdogan whilst those Turkish troops remain on Syrian territory. The reality is that he needs to meet with Erdogan in order to get Erdogan to withdraw those troops. There is, across much of the media space, a huge amount of anger and frustration about Turkey, about the role that Erdogan has played in this affair, and much criticism directed at Russia, President Putin in particular, and also Iran, about the fact that in spite of what is clear Turkish support for this invasion of northern Syria, the Russians and the Iranians continue to act as if the Turks were not involved, as if the constant protestations from Turkey that Turkey is not involved were true, and as if they believed them, and as if Turkey is a reliable partner in stabilizing the situation in Syria and once and for all ending the wars there. I think this criticism understates the leverage that Turkey has in this region and its overall importance, which for the Russians certainly, and for the Iranians possibly, exceeds the importance of Syria itself. It is important to remember that Turkey is a much bigger, far more powerful country than Syria, and its long-term alignments matter. Russia, in particular, has a thriving and very important economic relationship with Turkey. Turkey has become an important transit point for Russian gas, which is still being exported to Europe. Turkey is also involved with Russia in building a nuclear power station in Turkey itself. Millions of Russian tourists regularly visit Turkey on their holidays, and that's an important economic relationship in itself. Turkish construction companies have been heavily involved in building programs inside Russia. Turkey has been the beneficiary of extensive Russian investment. And Turkey and Russia have been working closely in recent weeks to try to create financial mechanisms to circumvent the latest sanctions that the United States has imposed, which threaten secondary sanctions on financial institutions that process money transfers going to and from Russia or with Russian entities. So there is a very strong economic relationship, and it is underpinned by security and geopolitical factors. So Turkey is an aspirant member of the BRICS. It has recently been allowed to join the BRICS, or at least partly allowed to join, invited to join the BRICS as a partner nation to the BRICS. It is seen by many in Russia as important for maintaining stability in Central Asia. And in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, Turkey has played an absolutely critical role from a Russian point of view by ensuring that Western warships cannot enter the Black Sea, because Turkey, observing the letter of the 1922 Montreux Convention, has closed the Dardanelles to warships from the West, preventing the West from establishing a major naval presence in the Black Sea. Obviously, the Russians do not want large numbers of Western warships patrolling the Black Sea at a time when the Black Sea is an area of conflict between themselves and Ukraine. So all of this gives Erdogan a significant amount of leverage over the Russians, which the Russians simply cannot afford to disregard. They may be perfectly well aware, in fact they are perfectly well aware, of the complex double game that Erdogan has been playing, but they have little practical choice, in fact, but to look the other way and to work with Erdogan to try to bring the situation in Syria back under control. And with the Iranians, ultimately, it is the same. The Iranians want to stabilize the situation in Syria. The Iranians want a secure situation on their northern and western borders at a time when they are in confrontation with Israel. So they need to keep their relations with Azerbaijan, where Turkey has paramount influence, stable. And of course they have a long border with Turkey itself and a shared interest with Turkey in preventing protectorates, Kurdish protectorates, being established under the aegis of the United States, with American troops patrolling them, as is already the case with the Kurdish protectorate that has been carved out in eastern Syria. So whether they like it or not, and of course they don't like it, the Russians and the Iranians have to work with Turkey and with Erdogan at this particular time. Erdogan, who is nothing if not a sophisticated player in these games, by the way, understands that also very well, and that perhaps has affected his timing, the timing of this particular move by the jihadist fighters into northwest Syria. Specifically, Erdogan almost certainly understands that once the war in Ukraine is ended, once the Russians have won in Ukraine, and he at least is in no doubt that the Russians are going to win in Ukraine. Erdogan knows that once that happens, a lot of his leverage is going to disappear. The Russians will no longer be quite so concerned about the presence of Western warships in the Black Sea, because they will control the northern coastline of the Black Sea, and there won't be a Ukrainian ally for the Western warships to team up with and support. The Russians also, at that point, probably calculate that with Ukraine defeated, the energy behind the sanctions that the West has been imposing will start to slacken. The sanctions themselves are most unlikely to be lifted anytime soon, but the Russians are probably saying to themselves, well, it's unlikely that the Western powers will enforce them with quite the same passion. It could be that some of the financial sanctions, which the Turks have been helpful in circumventing, are gradually going to quietly fall by the wayside. So, for all kinds of reasons, Erdogan's time window is relatively small. By the end of next year, we could have some kind of uneasy peace in Ukraine. The Russians are militarily far more powerful than they were in 2015. Their economy continues to grow rapidly. I will come to that shortly at the end of this program. And for all of these reasons, if Erdogan is going to make an impact in Syria, the time for him to do it is now, whilst the Russians are still distracted, are still tied down in Ukraine, and whilst the conflict in Ukraine continues to provide him with some degree of leverage over them. So that, I suspect, explains, at least in part, some of the timing of these latest moves. Now, that, however, brings us to the long-term solution to this. And this is where, again, all of these discussions between the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks about reviving the Astana format, the format whereby these three powers came together to bring stability to Syria, the Iranian approach to the Qataris, Pezeshkian's flattery of the Emir of Qatar as a moderator, great moderator, mediator, somebody who's able to bring the sides together. All of the talk about finding a way to a political solution. What all that says, at least to me, is that the Iranians and the Russians, once the situation in northwest Syria has been brought back under control, once Aleppo is once again under the control of the Syrian government, they're going to press Assad hard to put aside his feelings and his concerns, to be realistic, to sit down with Erdogan and to try to work towards an agreement with him. That might mean accepting that political forces that are aligned with Turkey in Syria are given some sort of voice in Damascus, that the government in Damascus starts to pay closer attention to the situation, to the opinions of the government in Ankara. Just saying. That might not be an easy thing for Assad to accept, but I think it is what the Russians and the Iranians are going to insist on. From a Russian point of view, if Turkey increases its influence in Syria, that is not a matter of concern. Far better to have the Syrians and the Turks on terms with each other than in conflict with each other, with continued instability in Syria, the possibility of flare-ups like the one we've just seen happen. Far better to avoid that and to get the Turks and the Syrians to start working with each other, at least to some extent. I suspect that from a Russian point of view, the optimal relationship between Turkey and Syria is actually the one which existed before 2011, when the uprising against President Assad began. At that time, and for some years previously, Syria and Turkey had seemed to be enjoying good relations. Erdogan and Assad had appeared to be friends. There was even some talk of Syria and Turkey forming some kind of united front, together with Iran, incidentally, against the Israelis to the south. Well, I think if some kind of relationship of that kind could be restored, the Russians would probably be happy. And of course, there's much discussion about influence in Syria, about the Russians and the Iranians and the Turks competing for influence in Syria. But it is important to stress that from a Russian point of view, provided their underlying security interests in Syria are respected, and provided the Assad government itself survives, Assad being recognized in Moscow as the one individual capable of preserving stability in Syria, there is no one else who can remotely take his place in that respect. From a Russian point of view, provided, as I said, their security interests are preserved and Syria remains stable, and provided they're able to continue to operate their base in northeast Syria, well, they don't want to be too deeply involved in Syrian affairs. They certainly don't want to micromanage the situation in the country. That's the kind of thing the Americans do. The Russians really are not part of that. It can be left to the Iranians and the Turks, and of course, first and foremost, the Syrians, to do it all for themselves. So I think this is probably what the Russians would want to see, and I'm going to suggest that this is probably the direction in which we're heading. So there will be a counteroffensive, the Syrian army backed by the Shia militias from Iraq, the Russian Air Force, perhaps returning Hezbollah fighters, will go on the offensive in northwest Syria. The jihadi fighters will be pushed back. Aleppo will be brought back under control. This is absolutely paramount and essential, but there will be pressure for some kind of broader settlement in the relations between Syria and Turkey, and this is something that all of the external parties, Russia, Iran, the Arab states, including Qatar, what all of them want. So that's it. That's where we are. Now, that still, of course, doesn't answer the question of why this sudden collapse in northwest Syria took place, why the Syrian army proved unable to withstand the jihadi fighters. There are some claims in the Russian media that the Syrian forces in northwest Syria actually outnumbered the jihadi fighters, which, if true, underscores the extent of the collapse. It would suggest that since the fighting ended, the main fighting ended in 2019, in the space of just 5 years, the Syrian army has rotted, and this will be a matter of great concern in Moscow and Tehran. They'll be asking themselves questions about how that came about, how all that effort to build a strong Syrian army that took place between 2011 and 2019, an effort that had appeared to pay fruit, how that all unraveled so quickly. They'll be concerned that what happened in Syria mirrors the collapse of the Iraqi army in Mosul when ISIS attacked and captured Mosul, and also the collapse, by the way, of the Afghan government army in Afghanistan in 2021. There'll be lots of agonizing debate and discussion about this and about what the problems in Syria are. But I think that for the moment, as I said, the priority is to do those two things: to help the Syrian army recover and regain control of the territory that's been lost, and then to work towards what is euphemistically referred to as a political solution, which means achieving some kind of rapprochement between Turkey and Syria in order to establish stability in this key part of the Middle East. I would finish by saying that from a Russian point of view, given how tough-minded and practical and realistic the Russians are, I think at some level they probably are telling each other that however strong Syrian feelings are about Turkey, given that Turkey is the most powerful state in the region, it is unrealistic for the Syrians to disregard that fact, and that the Syrians, in their own interests, absolutely do need to achieve a long-standing relationship with Turkey, even if doing so comes at the price of an extension of Turkish influence. So there we are. That's what I think about the situation in the Middle East. My own sense is that this is a temporary event in the Syrian war. And in fact, if it does lead to some kind of rapprochement, long-term rapprochement, this understanding between the Syrians and the Turks, between Assad and Erdogan, which is, as I said, what the Russians and the Iranians and the Qataris all seem to be working towards, then it could be the final end point of the Syrian war. But that all depends on military developments. The major counteroffensive has not yet begun. We'll see when it starts and how well it goes and how well the Syrian army performs. Because if the offensive is a failure, if it miscarries, then of course the calculus will change. Erdogan will conclude that Assad is not as strong as he appears. The Russians and the Iranians, but especially the Russians, might reach similar conclusions, and that might have a very, very important effect on developments going forward, with Turkey perhaps acting to extend its influence further into Syria, and perhaps the Russians gradually reducing their presence there. But I don't think that is going to happen. As I said, I think the forces that are being gathered in Syria are going to be enough to bring the situation under control and to reassert Syrian government authority over Aleppo and most of the northwestern regions. Anyway, that is where I finish my discussion about the Syrian situation. Up to this time, much, of course, is going on elsewhere in the world, but I'm going to turn now to the big story, which is the one, not the pardon of the president's son, which, by the way, I have always expected. I was quite sure that the president would do that. And can I say that if we're talking about events in Ukraine, and it is striking that the terms of the pardon, which are sweeping, extend all the way back to 2014. In other words, to the point when there was the seizure of power by the Maidan forces in Ukraine, and the president's son became deeply involved in commercial activity in Ukraine. Anyway, it seems to me that this is clearly an attempt not just to protect the son, to ensure that the son is not prosecuted or anything of that kind for any of the things that he might have done whilst he was enjoying lucrative directorships with Ukrainian companies, but also to protect the father, who appears at some level to have been, in fact, I suspect to a very great level, to have been implicated in some of these things. If you want a commentary about the legal implications of all of this and about the role of the father in these affairs, perhaps the best place to go is Res Ipsa Loquitur, the website of Professor Jonathan Turley, Professor of Constitutional Law at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., a brilliant trial attorney and a legal scholar. Anyway, he has discussed the president's conduct and that of his son, looking at these things with a lawyer's eye very extensively over several years now, drawing attention to the kind of things that the president has done. Anyway, I am not going to say more about this in this program because the current administration is now very definitely in its sunset. Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, has said that the administration is going to use its last 50 days to try to help Ukraine as far as possible in order to put it in the best conceivable negotiating position, which in effect is an admission that negotiations are indeed going to start and that they're going to take place after the current administration, after its life ends in 50 days. My own sense is that the administration has probably done all that it realistically can. It sent weapons to Ukraine, many weapons to Ukraine. It has allowed Ukraine, or assisted Ukraine, rather, to conduct missile strikes against the Russians, which has provoked devastating Russian responses. The missile strike on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro, the destruction of the ATACMS launchers, the 5 ATACMS launchers, the hunting down of Western personnel in Ukraine. I strongly suspect that there is going to be another Oreshnik strike at some point over the next few weeks, probably shortly before the president finally does leave office. I think the fact that there wasn't an Oreshnik strike yesterday on the 30th, the day before yesterday, on the 30th of November, absolutely does not mean that one is not going to happen. Just saying. But the point is that I think the administration has done pretty much all it can realistically do. And if you look at Sullivan, at what he's saying, they seem to understand that some kind of negotiation process is almost certainly going to begin after Donald Trump becomes president, because that is what Donald Trump and his officials want to see. And, well, we are getting more and more clues about this. Firstly, the Speaker of the upper house of the Russian Parliament, the Federation Council, Valentina Matviyenko, has also has given a long interview to a Russian newspaper, Argumenti I Fakti, in which she has said that she too believes that more likely than not some kind of negotiations will begin next year. But she's made it very, very clear again that the Russians are in no mood to consider any kind of compromises or fundamental concessions, that they're going to stick to the position that they have long since adopted, which is the one outlined by Putin in his address to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June 2024. That means acceptance by Ukraine that the entire territory of the 4 regions must pass to Russia, together with Crimea, an indefinite pledge by Ukraine that it's going to remain neutral and will not join NATO, and also substantial change to the internal arrangements within Ukraine itself, along the lines of those previously agreed in the Istanbul Accords. And this is what the Russian news agency TASS, which is, remember, an official government-owned news agency, this is some of the things that it quotes her as saying. Given such an unstable and unreliable domestic situation in the United States, which is expected to remain unchanged in the near future, we cannot and will not focus talks on some one-day half measures or agreements of undefined status, or discuss anything like a short-term freezing of the conflict and the like. This is certainly not the solution to resolve issues of long-term security in the region. President Putin outlined all the conditions, and it's only on this basis that genuine talks can be held. And then Matvienko, according to TASS, went on to say that Russia should not focus on Washington, waiting to see how things unfold there. We need to continue working independently to achieve our goals, which is what we are doing. In other words, the Russians must continue with the special military operation. They're perfectly willing to listen to what the Americans say, but proposals to freeze the conflict really are not acceptable. The minimum is what Putin outlined when he spoke to the Foreign Ministry in June. Freezing the conflict from a Russian point of view makes absolutely no sense, because whatever provisional or transitory agreements are reached with the Americans and with the Ukrainians can be reversed at any time by the United States and indeed by the Ukrainians, as has repeatedly happened. And the Russians are not looking for a temporary resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, but for a permanent one. Now, of course, that goes completely against what President Zelenskyy is seeking. President Zelenskyy, and he's given more interviews about this, and some people are seeing his very latest interview as supposedly walking back his alleged concession of a few days ago that Ukrainian territory can continue to remain for a while under Russian control, though Ukraine does in the end intend to take it back. I have never myself thought that Zelenskyy had made any concession at all there, and I think people looking for proof that there is a concession or a significant or fundamental concession there was simply engaging either in a little wishful thinking or not properly understanding Zelenskyy's words. Anyway, Zelenskyy is now saying that, yes, Ukraine is prepared for a certain amount of time to allow the Russians to remain in occupation of some Ukrainian territory, but that again is conditional on Ukraine entering NATO, and once Ukraine enters NATO, then of course NATO will be responsible for protecting that territory which is currently under Kiev's control, but Ukraine will enter NATO de jure, legally speaking, with all its territories, all of those territories which it controlled after 2021, when it became part of the Soviet Union, so that territories like Crimea and Donbas will, as far as NATO is concerned, not only still be Ukrainian, but they will be NATO territories as well. And that is what Zelenskyy is talking about. He's also said that he would welcome Western troops in Ukraine, though he says that he's afraid to bring this up because he knows that if he did, European troops, European states, might become frightened and might decide that they're not prepared to continue to support Ukraine. So we could see how grudging and superficial Zelensky's supposed concessions actually are. He wants to get Ukraine into NATO. He wants NATO to say not only that Ukraine is in NATO, but Crimea and Donbas are also in NATO as well. What he will then undoubtedly try to do is provoke another war with the Russians as soon as he possibly can, say that NATO needs to come to his rescue, and at that point, since Crimea and Donbas are NATO, part of NATO as well, NATO assistance should not then be limited simply to defending, say, Kiev. They should extend to, as Zelenskyy would put it, liberating Crimea and Donbas and all of these other places as well. This is simply more conjuring by Zelenskyy to try to get NATO, the West, directly involved in the war with Russia, which is the only way that even Zelenskyy realizes Ukraine can prevail in this conflict. So the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking about something completely different. The Russians want a final, sustained end to the war, one which will end the war on a permanent basis, providing Russia with the security of its western borders that it feels it needs, and which encompasses the whole of Ukraine, and ultimately and eventually the entire security situation in Europe. That is what the Russians want. Zelenskyy simply wants to create unsustainable outcomes which will ultimately lead to a NATO-Russia war, in which he hopes in the end to use NATO to recover all the territory that he says should belong to Ukraine, including Donbas and Crimea. There is no basis for a compromise or a negotiation here. Now, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has just travelled to Kiev, where he's going to be meeting with Zelenskyy. According to Bild Zeitung, the German newspaper, Scholz is coming to try and find out from Zelenskyy himself what are the terms upon which Zelenskyy is prepared to settle. And presumably, Scholz hopes that he can set out some kind of outline, plan that Zelenskyy will have to abide by, explaining to Zelenskyy what the limits of Western support are going to be. It is a complete waste of time. Whatever promises Zelenskyy makes to Scholz, and I'm not convinced that he's going to make any promises at all, whatever promises Zelenskyy makes to Scholz with a view to working towards a peaceful resolution to the crisis in Ukraine, ultimately Zelenskyy is not prepared to bend from his fundamental demand, which is that all Ukrainian territory must be recognized as Ukrainian and must be returned to Ukraine. There might be all kinds of temporary arrangements as to how that is done, but as I've just said, his latest proposal effectively sets the stage for a NATO-Russia war, which for some weeks now, for some months now, ever since the start of the crisis in the Pokrovsk area in the summer, Zelenskyy understands is the only way in which Ukraine can prevail in this conflict. As for Scholz, Zelenskyy, like virtually everyone, no doubt calculates that Scholz will no longer be around beyond February, that after the German elections in February, Scholz will be quitting the scene. So he must be asking himself, why does he need to make any real concessions, agree to anything that Scholz is asking of him? Friedrich Merz, who is the man most likely to become Germany's Chancellor in February, on the contrary, is more likely to take a much harder line than Scholz is doing. He's probably going to supply Ukraine with the Taurus missiles. So why not wait out Scholz until Merz appears on the scene, get the Taurus missiles, and make life even more difficult at that point for the Russians. In fact, this journey by Scholz to Kiev makes so little sense that I wonder whether it isn't ultimately, again, more about the German elections than about really seeking some kind of negotiation or peace formula to end the fighting in Ukraine. I say that because, as I discussed in a recent program, extraordinary though that must seem to many people, Scholz has recently been presenting himself to the German people in advance of the election as the peace chancellor, as opposed to Merz, Mr. Blackrock, as some people apparently in Germany call him, the aspirant chancellor of the CDU who wants to involve Germany in an unlimited confrontation with the Russians. Anyway, given that is or appears to be Scholz's major election pitch, what else, after all, does he have? Playing the role of the peacemaker, turning up in Kiev, telling Zelenskyy you must negotiate. Well, it plays to all of that, and perhaps might even win Scholz some support with the German public. Irrelevant in terms of the actual diplomacy to end the Ukraine war, though it really is. Far more important than Scholz's moves or Zelenskyy's latest statements are the telephone conversations which the Ukrainian media is now claiming are regularly taking place between Donald Trump and the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Now, as I discovered when Alex Christoforou and I went to Hungary about 10 days ago, whilst we were in Hungary, we were meeting with various Hungarian officials there. The Hungarians have a much more realistic understanding of the state of the war than pretty much any Western government has. And of course, Orban has been to Kiev, and he's been to Moscow, and he's had conversations with both Zelenskyy and Putin. And according to the Ukrainian media reports in places like the Kiev Independent and elsewhere that I'm reading, what Trump has been most interested in his discussions with Orban is Orban's views about the stance that the Russians are taking and about their determination with respect to the war. And the reports are saying that Orban is telling Trump that the Russians are absolutely determined to push on with the war, to press on with the war, and that they have the resources to do so, and that they're not really amenable to the kind of compromises that some people in the West apparently hope that they might be. And again, according to some of these reports, Trump has told Orban that he agrees with Orban's assessment. He too thinks, that is to say, Trump also thinks that the Russians are in the implacable mood that they say, and that they do absolutely have the resources to continue to conduct the war. And apparently, alongside General Kellogg's missions to Moscow and Kiev and to the European capitals, apparently Orban and Trump have talked about further visits by Orban, presumably to Kiev, but ultimately to Moscow also, with a view to trying to move the negotiation process forward. So there it is. This is what I think we're going to probably see. As I said, Trump himself, I think, if these reports are correct, understands very well that the Russians are going to take a hard line. Everybody, Scholz, Zelenskyy, Matveyenko in Moscow, now believes that negotiations are going to begin in 2025. Matveyenko says that for the Russians, the most important thing, however, is not to wait on the Americans. They've seen how unstable the Americans are, how one administration can promise one thing, the other administration can go back on it, that there is no confidence that anything that the Americans promise will ever be realized or will be secure for more than a few years, and that the Russians should continue, therefore, to fight and to win the war. We need to continue working independently to achieve our goals, which is what we're doing. That is what she said. And she and Putin and the Russians, of course, are all working with the knowledge that they have the high cards, that these missile strikes that the Ukrainians launched against them have turned out to be pinpricks. The Russians have demonstrated that with the Oreshnik, they have a far greater capability. In a recent interview, I noticed that General Kellogg has tried to understate the significance of the Oreshnik and has said that this should not be allowed to affect calculations about trying to get the Russians to agree to compromises and negotiations and that kind of thing. Obviously, the Russians have their own view about that, and I think that Kellogg may find that they're not as open to discussions as he expects. But anyway, one way or the other, I think that there will be negotiations, there will be discussions. There'll be discussions initially between the Americans and the Russians. There will probably be negotiations of some kind eventually between the Ukrainians and the Russians as well. Maybe the Europeans will be hovering in the background. Maybe General Kellogg will be hovering in the background as well. But the Russians have set out their terms, and Matvienko says that they're not going to retreat from them. Orban apparently thinks the same. And over time, I suspect that there is going to be more and more understanding of this, including by the Trump people in the United States. I say over time, but to repeat again, there is not unlimited time. The Russians have been conducting more strikes over the last couple of days on the Ukrainian energy system. And it seems that the transformers are now being systematically attacked and destroyed. There is now growing dismay across Ukraine and in the West about the ongoing collapse of Ukraine's energy system, with the nuclear power plants, Ukraine's vital nuclear power plants, being essentially the reactors being that their operation being restricted or even closed. Ukraine is having to import more power from the European Union in order to try to keep the lights on. But the European Union itself is now in grave trouble on the energy front. They invested massively politically in their various claims after 2022 that they had successfully weaned themselves off Russian gas and Russian oil. They claimed to have achieved resounding successes in that respect. That success was never truly achieved. In fact, they were only able to avoid blackouts by, in the case of Germany, closing down some of their industries, just say. And anyway, it has all come at a massive increase in prices, energy prices, which have rendered large sections of the European economy globally uncompetitive. But the situation is likely to get even worse fairly soon, because it seems that one of the key reasons why massive blackouts and other problems across Europe were avoided over the previous two winters is because those two winters were mild, and this winter, for various climatological reasons, which I'm not in a position to discuss, is likely to prove instead to be very cold. I noticed that the situation with gas storage in Europe is, well, it's not critical, but the amount of gas in storage within the EU territories is declining rapidly, much more rapidly than it did in the winter of 2022, 2023, or in the winter of 2023, 2024. Again, as I said, because winter looks like it's going to be much colder this year. Now, probably there aren't going to be blackouts, but it's very likely that energy costs are going to go on rising. And one does wonder what energy consumers across Europe are going to feel when they start getting their bills and they learn, as they will, because nowadays the media space with independent media, the internet, social media, all of that makes these facts impossible to conceal anymore. When these consumers discover that even as their own bills, household bills in many cases, bills for their employers, when all of these bills are rising, when they discover that the European Union, the European governments are continuing to send energy in short supply to try to keep the lights on in Ukraine, where President Zelenskyy continues to make any fundamental concessions to the Russians. So the situation on the energy and economic fronts is bad, and that is one reason for saying that time is not unlimited. But time is not unlimited either in terms of the military situation. Now, if we're looking at the key Donbas front, well, there's been some significant news over the last couple of days. First of all, it is now confirmed that the Russians are in control, or at least they've captured some, or most, or perhaps all of the village of Novi Komar, located immediately north of Velikaya Novosilka. Now, I say this, there is no doubt about the presence of the Russian troops there. They're said to be Ukrainian counterattacks to try to push the Russians out, but it doesn't seem as if these counterattacks are likely to succeed for all kinds of reasons. So Velikaya Novosilka now is in effect in a state of encirclement. The Russians already control the southeast part of this village, or this small town, strategically important town. They control positions to the south and west and east of Velikaya Novosilka, and they also control Novi Komar immediately to the north. That leaves only one route into Velikaya Novosilka, which is the road to the west, which passes through places like Guliapolye and Orekhov. And the Russians are approaching that road as well. And if the Ukrainians aren't careful, here also, they're likely before very long to find themselves in a cauldron. I suspect that the battle for Velikaya Novosilka is coming to a rapid end, and probably next week we will see the Ukrainians retreat from Velikaya Novosilka. It might even happen this week, in which case a huge territory is likely to fall under Russian control. If one looks at the situation with Velikaya Novosilka, it becomes clear how strategically important this particular small town is. And I'm not saying that the way will be open for the Russians to advance all the way to the Dnieper from Velikaya Novosilka, but certainly the fall of Velikaya Novosilka will put the Russians in a position where it is easier for them to advance towards the Dnieper, and also it will put the Russians in a good position to complete the capture further north of Pokrovsk. And if we go a little bit further and look at the further northeast from Velikaya Novosilka, look at the situation in Kurakovo, I think that the Russians now control around 70 to 80% of Kurakovo itself. There is now film which shows that the Russians are in firm control of Ilinka and Berezki, two villages on the northern side of the Kurakovo reservoir. There are reports this morning that the Russians have either entered or captured the village of Stary Terny, which is located at the western end of the Kurakovo reservoir. If that is true, then Kurakovo is effectively in a cauldron, just saying. And there's also apparently confirmation that the Russians do not perhaps control the entirety of Sontsivka, which lies, of course, immediately to the northwest of the Kurakovo reservoir, but that they do apparently control the greater part of it. And there's speculation that Sontsivka, the rest of Sontsivka, will have fully passed under their control within the next day or so. Well, these are all relatively small places. Kurakovo, Velika Novosilka, they may not seem like the most important places, but the key to understanding what is going on here is not to look at the size of these places, but to remember that we are talking about a battle taking place in southwestern Donbas between Pokrovsk in the north and Ugledar in the south. All of these captures of one place or another, all these encirclements of Ukrainian troops in all of these places, all of this must be understood as elements of this bigger battle that is taking place in this area, by far the biggest battle that has taken place in the war up to now. The Russians have been winning this battle, and they're winning it not just by capturing important territory, which, by the way, they are, bringing themselves closer and closer to the Dnieper, but also they're winning this battle in a way that effectively destroys the Ukrainian forces in southern Donbas. So these are key developments, and it is, by the way, also largely acknowledged that the Russian attack on Pokrovsk itself, once Pokrovsk has been isolated from its southern hinterland, is now just perhaps a few weeks away. So, once the Russians have won this battle, and they're also advancing in other places too, I've talked about Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, other places as well. Once the Russians have won this battle and have brought Donbas fully under their control, if they reach the river, if they reach the Dnieper, as I've said many, many times, things are going to become existential. And if they cross the river in central Ukraine, then they won't be existential any longer. They will become terminal. At that point, if the Russians are able to cross the Dnieper in central Ukraine, they're able to take cities like Zaporozhye and Dnipro, which they might be able to. Well, the whole viability of Ukraine as a state comes into question. And we may not be that far from that point now. So, prolonging the negotiations for too long, looking for outcomes and solutions that will somehow preserve Western face, could come at a terrible price. Well, there we are. This is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. And I'll be returning again tomorrow to discuss the latest events around the world. I'm going to see if I can find time to discuss the color revolution attempt currently underway in Georgia, for example. But obviously the events in Syria and in Ukraine remain the paramount story at the present time. And until tomorrow, have a very good day.